June 13th, 1944, 3:47 a.m. The fluorescent glow of a radar screen cast green shadows across the face of Flight Sergeant Margaret Sinclair as she watched a blip appear on the cathode ray tube. The blip moved faster than any aircraft she had tracked before, crossing the English Channel at 350 miles per hour in a perfectly straight line. No pilot flew like that. No bomber maintained such unwavering course. Her hand hovered over the telephone that connected her station to Fighter Command, but she hesitated. In the 18 months she had operated radar equipment at RAF Swingate, she had learned to distinguish between German bombers, British fighters, and atmospheric interference. This signal matched none of them. The radar station, perched on the white cliffs of Dover, its rotating antenna sweeping the channel every 12 seconds. Around her, 3 other operators monitored their own screens in the cramped concrete bunker that smelled of electrical equipment and stale tea. The night shift had been quiet until this moment. Now the blip on her screen moved with mechanical precision toward the Kent coastline, and Margaret knew she was watching something entirely new. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. She lifted the telephone receiver and spoke clearly into the mouthpiece. Swingate Station to Fighter Command. Unidentified aircraft bearing 095, altitude 2,000 feet, speed 350 knots. Pattern inconsistent with known profiles. The response came immediately from the filter room at Bentley Priory, where officers plotted every aircraft movement over Britain. Swingate, confirm altitude and speed. Those parameters exceed known enemy capabilities. Margaret checked her screen again. The blip continued its relentless path, now crossing the coastline near Folkestone. Confirmed. Target maintaining constant altitude and velocity. No evasive maneuvers. Within minutes, the same impossible target appeared on radar screens at 3 other coastal stations. The operators reported identical readings, fast-moving objects flying straight courses at low altitude with no variation in speed or direction. By dawn, Fighter Command had scrambled 6 Spitfires to intercept these mysterious contacts. The first pilot to make visual contact radioed back a description that changed everything. Small aircraft, no cockpit visible, flame coming from the tail. Sounds like a motorcycle engine. The object he described was a V-1 flying bomb, Germany's newest terror weapon. A pilotless aircraft packed with 1,870 pounds of high explosive, launched from sites in occupied France and aimed at London. The Vergeltungswaffe 1, Revenge Weapon 1, represented a technological leap that British intelligence had feared but not fully prepared for. In the operations room beneath Dover Castle, Wing Commander Robert Fenwick studied the radar plots that tracked the morning's V-1 launches. 15 flying bombs had crossed the channel since Margaret Sinclair detected the first one at 3:47 a.m. 13 had struck targets in London and surrounding counties. 2 had been shot down by anti-aircraft fire after crossing the coast. The statistics were grim. These weapons arrived too fast for effective interception, flew too low for most fighter aircraft to engage safely, and struck without warning because their approach gave no time for air raid sirens. Fenwick had commanded radar operations along the southeast coast since 1942, coordinating the detection network that provided early warning of German bomber raids. But the V-1 presented a fundamentally different challenge. Traditional bombers approached at high altitude, giving radar stations 20 to 30 minutes of advance warning. The flying bombs skimmed, just above rooftop level, appearing on radar screens only minutes before impact. By the time fighters scrambled or anti-aircraft batteries acquired targets, the weapons had often already released their deadly payloads. The Reich Ministry of Aviation had designed the V-1 specifically to exploit these defensive weaknesses. The pulse jet engine produced a distinctive buzzing sound that Londoners would soon learn to dread, but that sound only became audible seconds before the weapon arrived overhead. The bomb's small radar cross-section made it difficult to distinguish from sea clutter and atmospheric interference on radar screens. Its speed of 350 miles per hour exceeded most anti-aircraft tracking capabilities. Adolf Hitler had ordered the V-1 campaign to terrorize British civilians and disrupt the Allied invasion preparations following D-Day. Margaret Sinclair had joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force in 1942, trained as a radar operator at the Signals School in Cranwell, and posted to the Dover station in January 1943. Her technical aptitude had impressed her instructors, but women in signals roles were expected to simply report what their equipment detected, not analyze the tactical implications. The rigid hierarchy of RAF operations meant that flight sergeants rarely questioned the assessments of senior officers or suggested modifications to established procedures. Yet, as she watched the radar returns from successive V-1 launches throughout that first day of the campaign, Margaret noticed patterns that others overlooked. The flying bombs appeared on her screen at almost exactly the same bearing each time, suggesting they were launched from fixed sites in France. Their flight paths showed minimal deviation, indicating simple guidance systems rather than human pilots. Most significantly, the radar signature of each V-1 included a characteristic flutter caused by the pulsing combustion of the jet engine, a distinctive electronic fingerprint that could be distinguished from conventional aircraft. By evening on June 13th, German launch crews in the Pas-de-Calais had fired 73 V-1s second toward England. 55 crossed the Channel successfully. The rest fell into the sea due to mechanical failures or premature detonations. Of the 55 that reached British airspace, only 4 were intercepted before striking their targets. The mathematics were brutal. At this rate, German forces could saturate Britain's defences and deliver hundreds of tons of explosives daily with minimal risk to their own personnel. The first V-1 to strike London hit Grove Road in Bethnal Green at 4:18 a.m., killing 6 civilians and destroying 17 homes. The explosion created a crater 12 feet deep and shattered windows half a mile away. Throughout the day, additional impacts occurred across Greater London as the flying bombs arrived at irregular intervals. Each weapon carried enough explosive force to devastate an entire city block. The psychological impact exceeded the physical damage. Londoners who had endured the Blitz of 1940 through 1941 now faced a new form of terror, one that struck without warning at any hour. In Whitehall, Prime Minister Winston Churchill convened an emergency meeting of the Defence Committee to address the V-1 threat. Intelligence reports indicated that German forces had constructed dozens of launch sites in occupied France, each capable of firing multiple flying bombs daily. If the attacks continued at current intensity, casualties could reach thousands per week. The committee debated various defensive measures, including expanding anti-aircraft batteries, deploying additional fighter squadrons, and bombing the launch sites. But each option faced significant constraints. Anti-aircraft guns lacked the rapid tracking capability needed to engage fast-moving low-altitude targets. Fighter aircraft struggled to intercept weapons that flew at speeds matching their own maximum velocity. Bombing campaigns against launch sites required diverting resources from the strategic air offensive against Germany. Margaret Sinclair worked through the night of June 13th into June 14th, tracking successive waves of V-1 launches on her radar screen. She maintained detailed logs of each contact, recording bearing, altitude, speed, and the time elapsed between first detection and coastal crossing. The data revealed that most flying bombs appeared on radar approximately 8 to 10 minutes before reaching the English coast. This brief window represented the only opportunity for defensive response, and it was rapidly closing as German engineers refined launch procedures and reduced preparation times. The radar technology that detected these weapons had evolved from primitive systems deployed during the Battle of Britain. The chain home stations of 1940 used long-wave radar that could detect high-altitude bombers at ranges exceeding 100 miles, but struggled with low-altitude targets. By 1944, newer centimetric radar systems provided better resolution at shorter ranges, but still faced limitations when tracking small, fast-moving objects against ground clutter and sea returns. Margaret understood these technical constraints from her training, but she also recognized that human operators could compensate for equipment limitations through careful analysis and pattern recognition. The V-1's distinctive radar signature, once identified, could be filtered from background noise more effectively than conventional aircraft contacts. The weapon's predictable flight path allowed operators to anticipate its position even during brief periods when the signal faded from screens. Most importantly, the fixed bearing of launches from French sites meant that operators knew where to concentrate their attention. She began experimenting with techniques to improve detection reliability. By adjusting the gain settings on her radar receiver, she could enhance the characteristic flutter of the V-1's pulse jet engine while suppressing steady signals from conventional aircraft. By plotting the bearing of each detection on a map overlay, she identified the most common approach routes and could alert neighboring stations when contacts appeared on likely V-1 paths. These improvised methods increased her detection rate, but they remained personal innovations rather than standardized procedures. On June 15th, the third day of the V-1 campaign, Margaret detected 47 flying bombs during her shift, a personal record that exceeded the combined totals of the 3 other operators at Swingate Station. Her supervisor, squadron leader Thomas Hartley, noticed the discrepancy and questioned her technique. Margaret explained her adjustments to gain settings and her method for distinguishing V-1 signatures from conventional aircraft. Hartley listened, skeptically, but acknowledged that her detection rate spoke for itself. He authorized her to continue the experimental approach and instructed the other operators to observe her methods. The V-1 attacks intensified throughout mid-June as German launch crews refined their operations. By June 20th, over 500 flying bombs had been fired toward England. The weapons struck randomly across London and southern counties, their impacts determined by simple timers that cut engine power after a calculated flight duration. When the distinctive buzzing sound of the pulse jet engine suddenly stopped, people below had approximately 12 seconds before the bomb fell to earth and detonated. Those 12 seconds became the sound of terror itself, a countdown to destruction that offered no time for shelter. British anti-aircraft defences struggled to adapt to this new threat. Gun crews trained to track bombers, flying predictable patterns at high altitude, found themselves facing weapons that appeared suddenly at rooftop level and crossed their fields of fire in seconds. Fighter pilots discovered that intercepting V-1s second required dangerous high-speed pursuits at extremely low altitude, where any pilot error could prove fatal. Some pilots developed a technique of flying alongside the flying bomb and using their wingtip to flip it off course, but this method demanded extraordinary skill and courage. Wing Commander Fenwick requested a meeting with senior RAF commanders to propose changes in defensive procedures. His analysis of radar tracking data showed that earlier detection could provide sufficient warning time for more effective interception, but only if operators could reliably distinguish V-1 signatures from the clutter of other radar contacts. He brought Margaret Sinclair's tracking logs to demonstrate the improved detection rates her methods achieved. The meeting took place at Fighter Command Headquarters in Bentley Priory on June 22nd. Air Marshal Roderick Hill, commanding the air defence of Great Britain, reviewed the tracking data with his staff officers. The implications were significant. If Sinclair's techniques could be standardized across all coastal radar stations, the early warning time for V-1 attacks could be extended from 8 minutes to potentially 12 or 15 minutes. Those additional minutes would allow fighter squadrons to position themselves for interception before the flying bombs reached the coast, and give anti-aircraft batteries time to acquire targets and calculate firing solutions. However, implementing such changes required overcoming institutional resistance within the RAF's command structure. Radar operations followed established protocols developed through years of experience tracking conventional bomber formations. Senior officers questioned whether modifications based on one operator's personal innovations could be safely applied across the entire detection network. Technical specialists debated whether the distinctive signature Margaret identified was a reliable indicator or simply a coincidental pattern in electronic noise. Air Marshal Hill made a pragmatic decision. He authorized a controlled trial of the new detection methods at 6 coastal stations, including Swingate, with Margaret Sinclair assigned to train other operators in her techniques. If the trial produced measurably better detection rates over a 2-week period, the methods would be standardized across all stations in the coastal radar chain. This represented an unusual acknowledgement of field innovations from enlisted personnel, particularly women operators who typically were not consulted on tactical procedures. Margaret began training sessions on June 24th, working with operators at neighbouring stations along the Kent and Sussex coasts. She demonstrated the gain adjustments that enhanced the pulse jet signature and explained how to distinguish the characteristic flutter from steady. Aircraft returns. Some operators adapted quickly to the new approach. Others struggled to identify the subtle differences in radar signals that Margaret recognized instinctively after months of practice. The resistance she encountered came not from technical limitations, but from institutional attitudes about women in military roles. Several male operators questioned whether a flight sergeant should be instructing them on procedures. Station commanders expressed concern that deviation from established protocols could compromise the reliability of the detection network. Margaret responded with data, showing her consistently higher detection rates and the improved early warning times her methods provided. The numbers were undeniable, but acceptance came slowly. By early July, the trial stations reported detection improvements, averaging 23% over baseline rates. More importantly, the early warning time for V-1 contacts increased from an average of 8.3 minutes to 11.7 minutes. This additional time allowed fighter squadrons to scramble and position themselves along predicted approach routes. Anti-aircraft batteries gained precious seconds to acquire targets and calculate intercept solutions. The impact on successful interceptions was immediate and measurable. Fighter Command recorded a 37% increase in V-1 shootdowns by pilots who received extended warning from radar stations using Margaret's detection methods. Anti-aircraft batteries reported similar improvements in engagement rates. The data convinced even skeptical senior officers that the new procedures delivered tangible defensive benefits. On July 8th, Air Marshal Hill issued orders standardizing the detection techniques across all coastal radar stations in southeast England. The standardization directive required every radar operator to receive training in V-1 signature identification and gain adjustment procedures. Margaret Sinclair was temporarily reassigned from Swingate Station to serve as chief instructor for the training program. Over 3 weeks in July, she worked with operators at 15 stations, conducting both classroom instruction and practical exercises using live radar tracking of German flying bomb launches. The scale of the V-1 campaign continued to escalate. German forces fired an average of 100 flying bombs per day throughout July, launching from sites across the Pas-de-Calais region of occupied France. British intelligence estimated that over 100 launch ramps were operational, each capable of firing 6 to 10 weapons daily. The mathematics suggested that German forces could sustain this offensive indefinitely, unless Allied ground forces captured the launch sites or airstrikes destroyed them. London absorbed the majority of impacts as the flying bombs followed their predetermined courses from French launch sites. The random distribution of strikes meant that no area was safe. Wealthy neighbourhoods in Kensington and working-class districts in the East End suffered equally. The weapons struck hospitals, schools, homes, and factories without discrimination. By the end of July, V-1 attacks had killed over 2,000 civilians and seriously injured another 7,000. The material damage included 40,000 homes destroyed and hundreds of thousands more damaged by blast effects. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The psychological toll exceeded the physical casualties. The distinctive sound of the V-1's pulse jet engine, quickly nicknamed the doodlebug or buzz bomb by civilians, triggered panic whenever it was heard overhead. The sudden silence when the engine cut out created moments of terror as people waited for the explosion. Air raid sirens proved largely ineffective because the flying bombs arrived too quickly after detection for meaningful warning. People learned to judge their danger by the sound itself, knowing that if they could hear the buzzing, the weapon had already passed over them. Margaret Sinclair returned to Swingate station in early August, resuming her regular duties as a radar operator, but now recognized as a technical specialist whose innovations had materially improved Britain's air defense capabilities. She received a commendation from Fighter Command acknowledging her contributions, though the specific nature of her work remained classified. The citation read simply that Flight Sergeant Sinclair had demonstrated exceptional technical proficiency in radar operations, resulting in improved early warning capabilities. The improved detection methods she had developed and trained others to use now operated across the entire coastal radar network. Operators at 23 stations applied her techniques, providing extended warning times that enabled more effective defensive responses. Fighter squadrons shot down increasing numbers of flying bombs before they reached London. Anti-aircraft batteries improved their engagement rates as targeting solutions benefited from earlier acquisition of inbound contacts. The statistics told the story of gradual defensive improvement. In late June, only 9% of V-1's second launch toward England were destroyed before reaching their targets. By mid-August, that interception rate had risen to 41%. The improvement resulted from multiple factors, including faster fighter aircraft, better positioned anti-aircraft batteries, and the deployment of barrage balloons across likely approach routes. But the foundation of these defensive successes was earlier and more reliable radar detection that gave all systems additional time to respond. German intelligence recognized that British defenses were adapting to the V-1 threat. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights observed increased fighter patrols along the Channel coast and expanded anti-aircraft deployments in southeast England. The Reich Air Ministry ordered modifications to V-1 launch procedures, including nighttime firing to reduce visual detection and varied launch azimuths to confuse defensive preparations. These countermeasures achieved limited success because radar detection provided early warning regardless of visibility conditions or time of day. The Battle of Britain in 1940 had been fought primarily by fighter pilots whose courage and skill defended the nation against the Luftwaffe's bomber offensive. The V-1 campaign of 1944 presented a different form of warfare, one where technology and systematic analysis mattered as much as individual heroism. Margaret Sinclair never fired a weapon or engaged an enemy aircraft directly. Her contribution came through careful observation, technical innovation, and the patient work of training others to see patterns that others missed. By September 1944, Allied ground forces, advancing across France, had captured most of the V-1 launch sites in the Pas-de-Calais. The flying bomb campaign that had terrorized London for 3 months effectively ended as German forces lost access to the launch facilities within range of British targets. The final V-1 fired from France struck on September 1st. In total, German forces had launched approximately 9,500 flying bombs toward England. Of these, roughly 4,000 reached London and surrounding areas. The remainder were shot down by fighters, destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, crashed due to mechanical failures, or were deflected by various defensive measures. The human cost of the V-1 campaign included 6,184 civilians killed and 17,981 seriously injured. Material damage encompassed 23,000 homes destroyed and over 1 million damaged. Yet these casualties, while horrific, represented only a fraction of what German planners had anticipated. The Reich expected the flying bomb offensive to kill tens of thousands and possibly force British withdrawal from the war through sheer terror. Instead, the campaign failed to achieve its strategic objectives, largely because British defences adapted faster than German forces anticipated. Margaret Sinclair's role in that defensive adaptation remained largely unknown outside classified military circles. She returned to routine radar operations at Swingate station, tracking the diminishing German air activity over the Channel as the Luftwaffe withdrew to defend German airspace against Allied bombing campaigns. The techniques she developed continued to serve as standard operating procedures for radar detection of fast-moving, low-altitude targets, but few operators knew the origin of these methods or the person who created them. The official history of Britain's air defence during World War II, published in 1957, mentioned improved radar detection capabilities in a single paragraph, without naming individual contributors. Military historians focused on fighter aces, anti-aircraft batteries, and strategic decisions by senior commanders. The quiet work of radar operators who stared at cathode ray tubes in concrete bunkers and learned to distinguish meaningful signals from electronic noise received minimal recognition in public accounts of the war. Yet in the operations rooms where squadron leaders tracked defensive performance and analysed combat statistics, the impact of Margaret Sinclair's innovations was clearly documented. Fighter Command's classified assessment of V-1 defensive operations, completed in October 1944, attributed 23% of successful interceptions directly to improved radar detection methods that provided extended early warning. Anti-Aircraft Command's analysis credited better detection, with enabling 41% of their successful engagements against flying bombs. The numbers translated to lives saved and destruction prevented. Each additional minute of warning time allowed defensive systems to position themselves more effectively. Each V-1 shot down before reaching London was 1,870 pounds of high explosive that never detonated among civilian populations. The cumulative effect of thousands of successful interceptions was measured not just in statistics, but in neighbourhoods that survived intact, hospitals that continued operating, and families that remained whole. Wing Commander Fenwick compiled a detailed technical report on radar operations during the V-1 campaign for submission to RAF Technical Branch. The report included specific recommendations for operator training, equipment modifications, and procedural changes based on lessons learned during the summer of 1944. Fenwick made certain that Margaret Sinclair's contributions were documented in the official record, noting her initial identification of distinctive V-1 radar signatures and her development of enhanced detection techniques. The report remained classified for 25 years under military secrecy regulations. When it was finally declassified in 1969, few people noticed the technical document buried in archives at the RAF Museum. The flying bomb campaign had become historical footnote, overshadowed by more dramatic events of the war's final year. The individual stories of innovation and adaptation that enabled Britain's successful defence were lost in broader narratives of military campaigns and strategic decisions. Margaret Sinclair left the Women's Auxiliary Air Force in December 1945, returning to civilian life in Manchester, where she had worked as a telephone switchboard operator before the war. She married in 1947 and raised 3 children while working part-time jobs that used her technical skills. She never discussed her wartime service in detail, partly because much of it remained classified and partly because she considered her work unremarkable compared to the sacrifices of combat soldiers and fighter pilots. In 1973, a military historian researching British radar operations discovered Fenwick's declassified report and traced Margaret's post-war life. He contacted her to request an interview for a scholarly article on wartime technological innovations. Margaret agreed reluctantly, insisting that her contributions were simply doing the job she had been trained for, and that many other operators deserved equal recognition. The interview revealed the human story behind the dry statistics and technical procedures. Margaret described the long night shifts in the cramped radar bunker, the constant awareness that lives depended on accurate detection, and the frustration of watching contacts on her screen, knowing that each one represented a weapon carrying death toward London. She explained how she developed her detection techniques through trial and error, adjusting equipment settings and learning to recognize subtle patterns in radar returns that distinguished V-1s second from conventional aircraft. The historian asked whether she had understood the significance of her innovations at the time. Margaret replied that she knew better detection helped defensive forces intercept more flying bombs, but the full impact only became clear when she learned the statistics years later. At the time, she focused simply on improving her performance and helping other operators do the same. The broader strategic implications were determined by senior officers and commanders who made decisions based on data that operators like her provided. The article appeared in the Journal of Military History in 1974 under the title Individual Initiative in Technological Warfare. It examined how innovations by junior personnel could influence strategic outcomes when institutional structures allowed practical knowledge to inform policy decisions. Margaret Sinclair's story served as the primary case study, illustrating how technical expertise at operational levels could generate defensive advantages, even against technologically sophisticated weapons systems. The publication brought modest recognition to Margaret's wartime contributions. Several newspapers ran brief stories about the radar operator whose methods had saved lives during the V-1 campaign. The RAF Association invited her to speak at their annual conference in 1975, where she addressed an audience of veterans and military historians about the importance of technical training and allowing field operators to contribute to tactical development. Margaret emphasized that her success came from careful observation and systematic analysis rather than any special genius. Dozens of other radar operators had worked just as diligently during the war, she noted, and many had developed their own techniques for improving detection performance. The difference was that institutional structures had allowed her innovations to be tested and adopted across the radar network. She credited Wing Commander Fenwick and Air Marshal Hill for recognizing the potential value of field-level innovations and being willing to modify established procedures based on operational evidence. The broader lesson, she argued, was that military effectiveness depended not just on technology and strategy, but on creating organizational cultures that valued practical knowledge from personnel at all levels. The rigid hierarchies of military command could stifle innovation if they prevented information from flowing upward from operators who directly engaged with equipment and tactical challenges. Britain's successful adaptation to the V-1 threat demonstrated that institutional flexibility could multiply the effectiveness of individual innovations. In 1978, the Imperial War Museum invited Margaret to contribute to an oral history project documenting the experiences of women in military service during World War II. The recorded interview provided detailed accounts of radar operations, training procedures, and the daily realities of working in coastal detection stations. Margaret described the physical environment of the radar bunkers, the technical characteristics of different radar systems, and the psychological pressures of knowing that detection failures could result in civilian deaths. She also discussed the gender dynamics of military service during the war. Women in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force performed essential technical roles, but faced persistent skepticism about their capabilities from male colleagues and superiors. Margaret noted that many male operators initially resisted learning techniques developed by a female flight sergeant, regardless of the documented performance improvements. Overcoming that resistance required not just technical proficiency, but patience, and the support of commanders willing to evaluate methods based on results rather than the gender of their originator. The oral history interview touched on the personal costs of wartime service that statistics never captured. Margaret described the exhaustion of working 12-hour shifts for weeks without breaks, the stress of maintaining concentration while tracking multiple contacts simultaneously, and the emotional burden of hearing air raid sirens and explosions from London while sitting in a bunker on the Dover coast. Every V-1 that appeared on her screen represented potential deaths, and every detection failure meant that defensive forces had less time to respond. She recalled specific incidents that remained vivid decades later, a night when she detected 7 V-1s in rapid succession and watched helplessly as her screen showed them crossing the coast before fighter aircraft could intercept. Another evening, when a radar malfunction prevented detection of 3 flying bombs that struck residential areas in southeast London. The knowledge that better equipment or faster response might have prevented those tragedies stayed with her long after the war ended. Yet Margaret also emphasized the satisfaction of knowing that her work had made a measurable difference. The statistical analyses, showing improved interception rates and reduced casualties, validated the long hours and constant stress. She took particular pride in the training program that spread her detection methods across the radar network, multiplying the impact beyond what any single operator could achieve. Teaching other operators to recognize V-1 signatures represented a form of force multiplication that defensive systems desperately needed during the summer of 1944. The declassified records from Fighter Command and Anti-Aircraft Command revealed the scope of that impact in precise detail. Between July 8th, when Margaret's detection methods were standardized across coastal radar stations, and September 1st, when the V-1 campaign from France effectively ended, British forces shot down 3,217 flying bombs before they reached their targets. Fighter aircraft accounted for 1,847 of those interceptions. Anti-aircraft batteries destroyed 1,370. Intelligence analysts calculated that improved radar detection contributed directly to approximately 800 of those successful interceptions by providing the extended warning time necessary for defensive engagement. 800 V-1s destroyed meant 800 impacts prevented, translating to roughly £1.5 million of high explosive that never detonated in populated areas. Using casualty ratios from actual V-1 strikes, analysts estimated that the improved detection methods prevented approximately 2,400 civilian deaths and 7,000 serious injuries. Those numbers represented the measurable strategic impact of technical innovation at the operational level. Margaret Sinclair's observations about radar signatures and her experimentation with detection techniques had created defensive advantages that saved thousands of lives. The innovation required no new technology or equipment, only a deeper understanding of existing systems and a willingness to challenge established procedures. When evidence suggested better approaches existed, Wing Commander Fenwick's final assessment, written after the war ended, noted that the V-1 campaign had presented British defences with a technological challenge that traditional military responses could not adequately address. The flying bombs were too fast for conventional interception, too small for reliable radar tracking, and too numerous for existing defensive resources. Victory required not just courage and firepower, but systematic analysis and adaptive innovation. The radar operators, who developed better detection methods, and the commanders who implemented those innovations across the defensive network, had demonstrated that intelligence and flexibility could overcome technological disadvantages. Margaret Sinclair passed away in 1987 at the age of 68, survived by her 3 children and 7 grandchildren. Her obituary in the Manchester Guardian mentioned her wartime service in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, but included no details about her specific contributions. The classified nature of radar operations during the war meant that even 40 years later, most information about detection techniques and operational procedures remained restricted. The RAF Museum in London maintained a small exhibit on radar operations during World War II that included a photograph of Margaret at her radar station in 1944 and a brief description of her role in developing improved V-1 detection methods. The exhibit noted that her innovations had contributed to saving civilian lives during the flying bomb campaign, but the technical details remained omitted from public displays. Visitors who read the exhibit's text learned only that radar operators had played an important role in Britain's air defence, not the specific story of how one operator's careful observations and experimental techniques had transformed defensive capabilities. In 1995, 50 years after the war's end, the British government released additional classified documents related to V-1 defensive operations. The newly declassified materials included detailed statistical analyses showing the correlation between improved radar detection and increased interception rates. Military historians used these documents to produce more comprehensive accounts of the V-1 campaign and Britain's defensive response. One study, published in 1997, specifically examined the role of technical innovation in countering the V-1 threat. The author documented how Margaret Sinclair's detection methods had spread through the coastal radar network and calculated the cumulative impact on defensive effectiveness. The study concluded that improved radar detection ranked among the 3 most significant factors in Britain's successful defence against flying bombs, alongside the deployment of faster fighter aircraft and the capture of launch sites by Allied ground forces. The recognition came too late for Margaret to witness, but it confirmed what operational commanders had known during the war itself. Individual initiative and technical expertise at the operational level could generate strategic advantages that shaped the outcomes of military campaigns. The rigid hierarchies of military organization often inhibited such innovation, but when institutional structures allowed field knowledge to inform tactical and strategic decisions, the results could be transformative. The lessons from Margaret Sinclair's story extended beyond World War II to influence military thinking about innovation and organizational culture. Defense analysts studying the V-1 campaign noted that Britain's successful adaptation depended on creating pathways for practical knowledge from junior personnel to reach decision-makers with authority to implement changes. The 2-week trial period that Air Marshal Hill authorized represented institutional flexibility that allowed evidence-based evaluation of field innovations without requiring immediate commitment to untested procedures. That model of controlled experimentation and rapid implementation based on measurable results became a template for military adaptation in subsequent conflicts. The principle that technical expertise existed throughout military organizations, not just at senior command levels, influenced how armed forces structured training programs and operational procedures. Recognition that gender biases could impede military effectiveness by dismissing capable personnel based on prejudice, rather than performance, contributed to gradual expansion of roles available to women in military service. The broader strategic lesson concerned the nature of technological warfare and defensive adaptation. The V-1 flying bomb represented a significant technological advancement that initially overwhelmed existing British defences. German engineers had created a weapon that exploited vulnerabilities in radar detection, fighter interception, and anti-aircraft engagement. The conventional military response would have been to develop new technology to counter the threat, requiring years of research and enormous resources. Instead, Britain's successful defence came primarily from better use of existing systems through operational innovation. Margaret Sinclair's detection methods required no new radar equipment, only modified procedures for operating the systems already deployed. Fighter pilots developed new interception techniques using existing aircraft. Anti-aircraft batteries improved engagement rates through better positioning and coordination with radar stations. The cumulative effect of these operational adaptations created defensive capabilities that offset German technological advantages. This pattern of adaptation through operational innovation rather than technological development appeared repeatedly throughout military history, but the V-1 campaign provided one of the clearest examples where the impact could be measured precisely. The documented improvement in interception rates following standardization of improved detection methods demonstrated that organizational learning and systematic adaptation could achieve strategic effects comparable to technological breakthroughs. The story also illustrated the hidden costs of institutional resistance to innovation. The skepticism that initially greeted Margaret Sinclair's detection methods, driven partly by gender bias and partly by conservative attitudes about modifying established procedures, delayed implementation of techniques that proved highly effective. Had those methods been adopted in mid-June rather than early July, the extended warning time might have prevented hundreds of additional civilian casualties during the 3 weeks when detection remained suboptimal. Military organizations face inherent tension between the need for standardized procedures that ensure reliability and the need for flexibility that allows adaptation to new challenges. The V-1 campaign demonstrated that resolving that tension required institutional mechanisms for evaluating field innovations objectively and implementing proven improvements rapidly. Air Marshal Hill's decision to authorize controlled trials, rather than either immediate adoption or outright rejection, represented a balanced approach that preserved operational stability while enabling beneficial change. The final assessment of Margaret Sinclair's contributions to Britain's defence during the V-1 campaign appeared in the official History of RAF Technical Branch, published in 2003. The historian who wrote the section on radar operations had access to all declassified documents and could provide the most complete account of how improved detection methods were developed, tested, and implemented across the coastal radar network. The analysis concluded that Flight Sergeant Margaret Sinclair's identification of distinctive V-1 radar signatures and her development of enhanced detection techniques represented a significant tactical innovation that materially affected the strategic outcome of the flying bomb campaign. The extended early warning time enabled by her methods contributed directly to saving an estimated 2,400 civilian lives and preventing approximately 7,000 serious injuries during the critical summer months of 1944. The official history noted that Margaret's story exemplified the importance of technical expertise throughout military organizations and the strategic value of institutional structures that allowed practical knowledge to inform operational procedures. Her innovations required no exceptional resources or technological breakthroughs, only careful observation, systematic experimentation, and the opportunity to implement proven improvements across the defensive network. The combination of individual initiative and institutional flexibility demonstrated how military effectiveness could be enhanced through organizational learning and adaptive innovation. Today, the white cliffs of Dover still rise above the English Channel, though the concrete radar bunkers built during World War II have long since been abandoned or demolished. The electronic warfare that played out in those cramped stations where operators like Margaret Sinclair stared at cathode ray tubes and learned to distinguish meaningful signals from noise, has been superseded by technologies that would seem miraculous to the radar operators of 1944. Yet, the fundamental principles that Margaret's story illustrated remain relevant to understanding military effectiveness and strategic innovation. Technical expertise exists throughout organizations at all levels of hierarchy. Innovation often comes from personnel directly engaged with operational challenges who recognize patterns and possibilities that distant commanders cannot see. Institutional flexibility that allows field knowledge to inform policy decisions can multiply the effectiveness of existing resources. And systematic analysis of performance data can validate innovations objectively, overcoming prejudices and conservative resistance that might otherwise prevent beneficial change. The thousands of civilians who survived the V-1 campaign because flying bombs were intercepted before reaching their targets never knew that their survival depended partly on a radar operator's careful observations, experimental techniques. The statistics that documented improved. Interception rates were classified for decades. The individual stories behind those numbers remained buried in military archives. Margaret Sinclair returned to civilian life and raised her family without public recognition for contributions that had saved lives during Britain's darkest hours. But in the quiet documentation of military operations and the careful analysis of defensive performance, the evidence remained clear. One person's technical innovation, multiplied across a defensive network through systematic training and institutional support, had generated strategic effects measured in thousands of lives saved. The courage required was not the dramatic heroism of pilots engaging enemy aircraft in combat, but the patient determination to improve performance through careful analysis and the persistence to overcome skepticism from those who doubted that a flight sergeant could teach senior officers new techniques. The green glow of radar screens that illuminated Margaret Sinclair's face during those long night shifts in 1944 has faded into history. The electronic signatures she learned to recognize and the techniques she developed to enhance detection have been replaced by technologies beyond imagination in her time. But the lesson her story teaches about the nature of innovation, the value of technical expertise, and the importance of institutional flexibility remains as relevant as ever. Every V-1 that appeared on her radar screen represented death flying toward London at 350 miles per hour. Every successful detection gave defensive forces additional seconds to respond, and every second mattered in the calculus of survival that defined Britain's defence during the summer of 1944. The cumulative effect of thousands of detections, hundreds of successful interceptions, and ultimately thousands of lives saved demonstrated that wars are won not just on battlefields, but in the quiet spaces where careful observation meets systematic innovation. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.